The morning sun bathed the village of St. Mary Mead in a golden glow, softening the edges of the quaint cottages and the neatly trimmed hedgerows. Honeysuckle Cottage, perched at the very end of Lavender Lane, was already a hub of activity. Its current occupant, Mrs. Agatha Brimley, had declared a garden party in celebration of her niece's engagement, and the village's social calendar now revolved entirely around the event. Miss Marple, seated quietly on a wrought-iron bench near the edge of the rose garden, adjusted her spectacles and watched with mild interest. She had received the invitation, as she always did, with an understanding that appearances were rarely as simple as they seemed. Her eyes, small and sharp behind their lenses, observed every movement, every smile that seemed too bright, every hand that trembled with restrained impatience. The party was unfolding with the expected propriety. Mrs. Brimley fluttered among her guests, a delicate figure in a pale blue dress, her pearls catching the sunlight with each animated gesture. Mr. Leonard Brimley, her husband, kept a distant watch, nodding courteously, but speaking little. The local vicar, Reverend Thomas Carrington, exchanged pleasantries with a small cluster of women, while the butcher's wife and the village baker leaned conspiratorially over the punch table. The children, unencumbered by social rules, ran between the flower beds, their laughter mingling with the soft hum of bees. Miss Marple sipped her tea with unhurried deliberation, noting the subtle undercurrents beneath the cheerful veneer. She noticed that Mrs. Brimley's niece, Clarissa, seemed distracted, constantly glancing toward the far end of the garden where Honeysuckle Cottage's old ivy-covered pergola stood. There was a restlessness in her movements, a slight tightening of her lips whenever a certain young man approached, a man whose charm seemed a little too practiced for a small village setting. "It's such a lovely morning, isn't it, Miss Marple?" Mrs. Brimley's voice was bright, but it carried the faintest tremor, almost imperceptible, as she placed a tray of sandwiches before her guests. "Yes, indeed," Miss Marple replied. "The roses are particularly fragrant today. They do seem to attract more than just the bees, don't they?" She smiled innocently, but her mind catalogued every expression, every fleeting glance exchanged among the assembled partygoers. A sudden stir near the gate drew her attention. A figure had arrived unexpectedly, a man unknown to most, his appearance precise but with a shadow of unease. He wore a dark coat and a hat tilted slightly forward, giving him the air of someone both careful and cautious. A few murmurs rippled through the party. "Who is he?" whispered one of the younger women. "I've never seen him in the village before." Miss Marple, without moving her gaze, noticed Clarissa's face pale momentarily, then flush with a mixture of recognition and apprehension. The man approached the Brimleys with an assured step, bowing slightly, his eyes sweeping over the gathering as though assessing them, weighing them, silently measuring each person's potential worth or weakness. "Good morning, everyone," he said in a tone that was polite, yet carried a subtle weight of authority. "I hope I am not intruding. I am Mr. Philip Ashcroft, a friend of Clarissa's family from London." Clarissa's relief was barely contained, though Miss Marple noted the tension that lingered in her posture. A village stranger was rarely an unremarkable presence, and strangers often arrived bearing truths or troubles. As Mr. Ashcroft joined the circle around the punch table, Miss Marple's attention wandered to the corners of the garden. There, the shadows of the pergola stretched long across the lawn, and she could see the faint outline of a window ajar in Honeysuckle Cottage itself. A quiet voice in her mind reminded her, windows are rarely open for the sake of fresh air alone. Curiosity, secrecy, and mischief often find their way into such small, overlooked openings. By mid-morning, the garden was a swirl of laughter, polite chatter, and the occasional sharp note of discontent disguised as casual comment. Yet Miss Marple remained composed, her knitting resting idle in her lap. She was aware, as always, that in the most ordinary of gatherings, the most extraordinary events often waited silently in the wings, and it was only a matter of time before one of them would step forward into the light. and perhaps into something far darker than the gentle sunshine of St. Mary Mead. The chatter in the garden lingered long after the initial introductions had been made, though now it carried a slightly different tone. Small clusters of villagers huddled near the flower beds, and beneath the shade of the apple tree, voices lowered to conspiratorial murmurs. Miss Marple, still seated with her tea cooling beside her, observed these shifts with quiet attention. She noticed that certain guests lingered too long near the punch bowl, exchanging quick glances and half-smiles that did not reach their eyes. Others, like Mrs. Brimley herself, floated from group to group with an effort that seemed almost theatrical, as though the lightness of her laughter was meant to mask a worry. Clarissa, meanwhile, appeared to drift between conversations with mechanical politeness, her eyes repeatedly flicking toward the pergola at the far end of the garden. There was a tension in her shoulders, subtle yet unmistakable, as though she were expecting, though perhaps dreading something or someone. Miss Marple's keen gaze caught the small, almost imperceptible twitch of her hand when Mr. Ashcroft mentioned a recent visit to London. It was too fleeting for anyone else to notice, but it spoke volumes to the observant mind. This visitor, this stranger, had stirred memories or emotions that Clarissa found difficult to contain. Soon, the village postman, Mr. Harold Finch, arrived, his uniform slightly rumpled and his bag swinging at his side. His presence brought an unexpected liveliness, though the content of his gossip carried a faint edge. "Did you hear?" he whispered to a group clustered near the roses. "About old Mrs. Cartwright. Apparently she claims she saw lights moving in Honeysuckle Cottage last night. Strange, isn't it?" A ripple of murmurs followed, though some of the younger guests laughed it off as the eccentricities of age. Miss Marple, however, inclined her head slightly, noting that such stories often contained kernels of truth disguised in the exaggerations of the teller. By mid-morning, the initial polite chatter had given way to speculation, though none yet dared to speak of any danger outright. Villagers exchanged cautious questions, their words weaving a delicate web of suspicion that seemed almost imperceptible. Mrs. Brimley overheard a comment about the arrival of Mr. Ashcroft and approached the group with a forced brightness. "He's only here because he comes from London, my dear," she assured, though her voice faltered slightly. "There is no cause for concern. We are merely enjoying our morning." Yet Miss Marple could see the quick, darting glance Clarissa sent toward the pergola, and the faint creasing of worry on her aunt's brow betrayed her attempts at calm. As the sun climbed higher, the shadows beneath the pergola lengthened. Miss Marple's attention drifted naturally to that small alcove of greenery, where a few chairs had been pushed aside, and the stone pathway showed faint signs of footprints, some fresh, others older. There was a slight disruption in the otherwise orderly garden, enough to suggest a visitor had passed through recently. Yet the footprints alone offered no clear story. It was not what they were, but what they might conceal that piqued her curiosity. The children's laughter, once light and carefree, now carried hints of hesitation. Even in their innocence, Miss Marple could discern a subtle awareness of tension in the air. Little Jane Tilling, the baker's youngest daughter, clutched her doll to her chest and kept glancing toward the cottage window, her small brow furrowed. Miss Marple's mind catalogued the significance. Children notice what adults overlook, and often their quiet observations carry truths uncolored by pretense. Then came the moment that shifted the day's atmosphere imperceptibly but decisively. A shrill cry echoed from the garden path near the edge of the hedgerow where no one had thought to linger. A maid, breathless and pale, stumbled forward, calling for help. The guests turned en masse, curiosity and alarm mingling in equal measure. Miss Marple rose calmly from her bench, her sharp eyes immediately assessing the source of the disturbance. There, behind the hedge, lay a small bundle of clothing, disheveled, disturbed, yet unmistakably human in shape. The breath of Those gathered caught, some stepping back instinctively, while others leaned forward, eager for an explanation. Miss Marple, however, took no step closer. She observed quietly, her mind already forming tentative connections between the peculiar arrival of Mr. Ashcroft, the restless anxiety of Clarissa, and the subtle disturbances around Honeysuckle Cottage. Something hidden beneath the garden's serene veneer had made itself known, and it would take more than casual speculation to understand it. The garden, once alive with laughter and polite chatter, now hung in an uneasy silence. Miss Marple, poised and observant, understood instinctively that the morning's gentle social gathering had been forever altered. Beneath the calm English sun, the first tendrils of a much darker story were beginning to unfold, and every villager, whether they realized it or not, had a role to play in the secret that had been uncovered. The maid's cry had drawn the attention of nearly everyone, yet it was Miss Marple who moved first, her steps measured and calm, her keen eyes taking in every detail as the crowd parted before her. The small bundle behind the hedge, now more clearly revealed, was not a child or a doll, but a lifeless body, partially hidden among the leaves and twigs. The sight caused a ripple of shock, some guests stepping back, their faces blanching, while others whispered frantically, trying to make sense of the sudden horror. Mrs. Brimley clasped her hands to her mouth, her knuckles white, while Clarissa stepped forward instinctively, a faint tremor running through her frame. Miss Marple, however, maintained her composure, noting the precise positioning of the body, the way the clothing was slightly askew, and the faint traces of soil on the hands and hem. There was something deliberate in the arrangement, though to the untrained eye it would appear chaotic. Reverend Carrington was the first to speak aloud, his voice carrying over the whispers. "We must fetch the police at once. There has been a terrible accident." His eyes, wide with shock, darted from the body to the surrounding guests, as if to ensure that no one present bore immediate suspicion. "Accident," Miss Marple murmured under her breath, almost to herself, as she bent slightly to examine a loose sprig of honeysuckle that had fallen near the body. The subtle fragrance, the slight indentation in the grass beneath the hedge, the absence of a scuffle, all these details, unnoticed by the others, began to form a quiet narrative in her mind. Something about this did not align with the randomness of an accident. By the time Constable Harris arrived, summoned in a flurry of polite urgency by the postman, the village garden was a tableau of muted panic. The constable, young and eager but inexperienced, immediately began to cordon off the area and take statements. His questions were routine, predictable. Who found the body? How long has it been here? Was anyone alone with the victim? Each query drew out stammered responses, nervous admissions, and, inevitably, contradictions. Miss Marple, observing from a discreet distance, noted that several guests were particularly careful in their wording, choosing each sentence as if it were a step across thin ice. The young man who had arrived with Clarissa, Mr. Ashcroft, seemed unnaturally calm, his hands folded in front of him, though Miss Marple's practiced eyes detected the faint twitch of a jaw muscle, the subtle narrowing of his eyes when the body was mentioned. Clarissa herself had taken to pacing a short distance away, wringing her hands with a nervous energy that betrayed a combination of fear and relief. Relief, Miss Marple thought, not for the victim, but perhaps that some secret, long buried, had not yet been fully exposed. Children clustered nearby, sensing the tension but too young to understand the gravity of what had occurred. Jane Tilling, her doll abandoned on the grass, watched silently, her wide eyes taking in everything while saying nothing. "Miss Marple," whispered Mrs. Brimley, stepping lightly toward her, "I don't know what to do. Who would do such a thing here, in the village, in my garden?" Her voice cracked with emotion, but Miss Marple merely patted her hand reassuringly. "We shall know soon enough, my dear," she said gently. But one must always remember that people are rarely what they seem. Even in a quiet village like this, motives hide where we least expect them. Meanwhile, the constable had begun questioning each of the guests in turn, scribbling notes that often reflected what they thought rather than what they knew. Gossip and half-truths mingled freely with genuine observations, creating a confusing tapestry of statements. Miss Marple, however, listened more than she spoke, cataloguing each tiny contradiction, every unspoken hesitation, every glance that lingered too long. As the crowd slowly dispersed under the constable's direction, whispers carrying speculation about quarrels, debts, and old village rivalries, Miss Marple's attention was drawn once more to the pergola. Beneath its shade, she found a fragment of lace, delicate and distinct, barely caught among the ivy tendrils. It was far too small to be noticed by anyone else, yet to Miss Marple it spoke volumes, a trace of someone's presence, overlooked in haste, yet quietly insisting upon recognition. The garden, once cheerful with the laughter of a morning party, now held a tense, fragile stillness. Everyone seemed to wait, as if the sun itself had paused, for the police to pronounce judgment or the next revelation to unfold. But Miss Marple knew better. She understood, as she always did, that appearances were a fragile veil and that beneath the surface, the truth, often cruel, often astonishing, was already quietly making itself known. The constable, slightly flustered by the rapid escalation of events, continued his questioning with a mixture of diligence and uncertainty. His notebook, already full of hastily scrawled observations, grew heavier with every new confession, each guest eager to place themselves as witness rather than suspect. Miss Marple, meanwhile, observed silently from a corner of the garden, her small frame deceptively unassuming, her sharp eyes tracking not only the words spoken but the subtle gestures, the fleeting expressions that betrayed a deeper truth. Clarissa remained near the edge of the rose bushes, her fingers twisting the folds of her gloves as if drawing reassurance from the fabric. She spoke to no one, though several villagers approached her with tentative words of comfort. Her engagement, once a cheerful topic of discussion, now seemed like a fragile shield against the uncertainty that had invaded the morning. Miss Marple noted the slight quickening of her breath each time Mr. Ashcroft's name was mentioned. It was a pattern, a small but telling clue to the mind attuned to human nature. The body behind the hedge, though still covered by a hastily placed shawl, was now partially examined by the constable. He muttered under his breath, detailing what little he could deduce. A young man, apparently in his early 30s, well-dressed but with signs of struggle on his coat. Miss Marple's mind catalogued these details quietly, noting the subtle absence of blood or outward signs of violence. The victim's position and expression suggested not a sudden frenzy, but an act carefully orchestrated, intended to convey a message or conceal a truth rather than merely harm. Villagers whispered among themselves, some speculating about old rivalries, others about debts unpaid or unspoken romantic entanglements. Miss Marple recognized the familiar pattern. Fear and curiosity, mingled with gossip, often provided far more insight than the loud declarations of innocence. One could discern not only what had happened, but why, simply by observing how people reacted, what they omitted, and what they exaggerated. Mrs. Brimley, having regained some composure, insisted upon remaining close to Clarissa, her auntly presence a thin veneer of security. She moved with careful steps, her eyes scanning each guest as though seeking reassurance from the living to counter the shock of the dead. Miss Marple, watching her, realized that the anxiety in Mrs. Brimley's gaze was more than mere worry over her niece. It was the unease of someone who sensed, perhaps even vaguely remembered, a secret best left undisturbed, a memory now stirred by the violent intrusion into the morning's peace. Mr. Ashcroft, for his part, stood near the edge of the gathering, calm yet observant. His hands remained folded in front of him, his posture impeccable. Yet Miss Marple detected the minuscule tightening at the corners of his eyes and the faint shifting of weight from one foot to the other. These were the subtle signs of someone engaged in careful calculation, measuring the reactions of those around him, perhaps seeking to control the narrative even without words. Miss Marple's gaze drifted once again to the pergola. The ivy seemed denser here, the shadows deeper, and in the slight rustling of leaves she thought she heard a whisper of movement. Not human, perhaps, but the residual impression of it. She made a mental note. The garden itself, the very structures meant to provide shelter and beauty, could contain secrets as readily as any person. One small slip, a footprint, a dislodged leaf, a dropped item, might provide the key to untangling the web now forming. The children, having been kept under the careful eye of the housemaid, now gathered cautiously around the edge of the crowd, their curiosity subdued by the sudden gravity of events. Jane Tilling, her small hands tightly gripping her doll, peered at the body with wide, solemn eyes. Children often noticed things adults overlooked. The direction of a gaze, the fleeting gestures, the hesitation before a word was spoken. Miss Marple, recognizing this, quietly resolved to speak with Jane later, certain that the girl's observations, though fragmentary, could hold invaluable pieces of the puzzle. As the morning stretched toward noon, the constable called for calm and attempted to restore order, but the atmosphere remained taut with unspoken tension. Every polite smile, every sideways glance, and every careful word contributed to a growing sense of unease. Miss Marple, as always, remained serene, her mind quietly weaving together the strands of information, observing the behavior of each villager, and patiently waiting for the moment when the small, overlooked details would reveal the larger truth. Beneath the gentle sunshine of St. Mary Mead, a quiet storm of suspicion and hidden motives had begun to take shape, and Miss Marple understood instinctively that the most ordinary appearances were now laced with extraordinary significance. Each guest, each movement, each whispered remark would soon play its role in uncovering the deeper secret lurking behind Honeysuckle Cottage's serene facade. The constable, having secured the immediate scene and taken the first round of statements, seemed slightly overwhelmed by the intricate social dynamics now unfolding. Villagers continued to cluster in small, uneasy groups, their voices hushed yet tinged with excitement and fear. Miss Marple, seated on the garden bench once more, observed with her usual calm precision, her knitting forgotten in her lap as her mind catalogued the subtle signs of tension, avoidance, and guarded curiosity. Clarissa had withdrawn to the shade of a flowering magnolia, her hands pressed lightly over her face as if attempting to still the fluttering of her thoughts. She was not crying, but her eyes betrayed a turmoil she was careful to conceal. Mr. Ashcroft had positioned himself nearby, though not so close as to intrude, his gaze flicking constantly between her and the gathering of villagers. There was a quiet attentiveness to his demeanor, a readiness to respond, yet it carried the faintest shadow of calculation. Miss Marple noted this silently, her mind tracing the connections between his arrival, Clarissa's tension, and the subtle disturbances in the garden. Mrs. Brimley, unable to remain idle, moved among the guests, offering small reassurances and polite inquiries, though her words seemed more intended to soothe herself than anyone else. Miss Marple watched her closely. The performance of calm in Mrs. Brimley's voice did little to disguise the underlying anxiety, the careful manner in which she avoided discussing the body directly. Her attention flitted continually toward the pergola, the ivy-covered window, and the far side of the garden, as though she feared some unseen consequence lurking beyond sight. The constable, meanwhile, had begun a second round of questioning, this time asking about movements during the night and any unusual visitors in the days preceding the party. Most villagers insisted they had seen nothing, yet Miss Marple noticed discrepancies in the details they provided. Slight hesitations, over-elaborated explanations, and the occasional hurried glance toward a neighbor. Such moments, she knew, were far more revealing than the words themselves. People inadvertently betray their own connections and fears, and Miss Marple had learned to read them with the precision of a watchmaker. It was during this lull that a subtle, almost imperceptible sound caught her attention, the gentle creak of the pergola's wooden frame as if something had brushed against it. She turned her head slowly, noting a faint movement behind the ivy, just enough to suggest that someone had been there recently, perhaps observing the unfolding scene. It was a minor detail, easily overlooked, yet to Miss Marple it hinted at both opportunity and knowledge. Someone who had seen, or perhaps caused, the disruption that had brought the body into the garden. The children, no longer entirely restrained by the presence of adults, began whispering among themselves, pointing discreetly toward the hedge and the distant cottage window. Miss Marple's eyes softened slightly at their curiosity. Children often notice what adults ignore, and even the smallest observations could provide a critical key to understanding events. She resolved quietly to speak with little Jane Tilling, knowing that the girl's perspective, though innocent, might contain an important clue hidden in plain sight. The arrival of a telegram carrier added a new layer of intrigue to the morning. The young man approached with cautious deference, handing the envelope to Mrs. Brimley, who opened it with trembling fingers. Her face, already lined with concern, grew paler still as she read the message. Miss Marple's sharp eyes caught the way she pressed a hand to her lips, the small shudder that betrayed an emotion deeper than mere surprise. Curiosity whispered that the contents were connected to the visitor from London, though she remained outwardly composed, letting the constable take the telegram and deliver its contents to the local inspector without drawing undue attention. As the minutes passed, the villagers' murmurs deepened. Questions about motives, long-standing grudges, and unexplained absences began to circulate with renewed vigor. Yet Miss Marple, observing the same words and gestures that excited the others, detected a rhythm beneath the chaos, a subtle pattern of human behavior that would eventually reveal both opportunity and intent. She noted the casual avoidance of eye contact from several key guests, the slight tightening of hands in pockets, the almost imperceptible shifts in posture as if each were preparing for a revelation or deflecting suspicion. By the time the inspector arrived, summoned in an official capacity from the nearby town, the mood had become tense, layered with anxiety and restrained speculation. The villagers, outwardly polite, carried the invisible weight of uncertainty, while Miss Marple remained serene, her mind quietly assembling the fragments of observation, the whispers of the children, and the fleeting motions of the adults into a coherent whole. She knew that the garden's serenity had been irrevocably broken, and with it, the village had entered a delicate dance of hidden motives and cautious truths. The day, though still bright with sunlight, had grown heavy with implication. Beneath the polite surface of St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple understood that every smile, every evasive glance, and every seemingly casual remark could be a thread leading directly to the heart of the mystery. Threads she intended to follow, patiently and relentlessly, until the concealed truth of Honeysuckle Cottage revealed itself fully. By mid-afternoon, the inspector had established a tentative perimeter around Honeysuckle Cottage and the adjoining garden, though the villagers lingered nearby, their curiosity and apprehension intermingling like shadow and light. Miss Marple, seated quietly beneath the magnolia, observed them all with the unassuming patience of someone accustomed to the hidden currents beneath genteel facades. She noted the small signs, the restless fingers, the darting eyes, the carefully measured smiles, that spoke of concealed truths and restrained emotions. Clarissa, having been gently persuaded to sit by her aunt, still appeared uneasy. Her hands trembled slightly as she toyed with the folds of her gloves, and her gaze frequently strayed toward the hedge where the body had been found. Miss Marple understood the signals. The young woman was struggling with conflicting emotions, both fear and relief, her mind attempting to reconcile the shocking reality of the morning with the delicate threads of her own private knowledge. Mr. Ashcroft had taken a position near the garden's edge, ostensibly to observe, but Miss Marple detected the subtler motives behind his stance. He maintained the perfect outward calm, yet his eyes constantly scanned the group, gauging reactions and registering small shifts in posture and expression. It was a deliberate, almost calculated watchfulness, one that suggested both interest and investment in the outcome. Miss Marple made a mental note to keep a close eye on him. The inspector, methodical and precise, began interviewing the guests more formally, asking about their whereabouts during the hours before the body's discovery. Answers were cautious, polite, and sometimes contradictory, revealing, as Miss Marple suspected, more about the speakers than the events themselves. A simple hesitation, a too long pause before responding, or a glance at another guest often betrayed a greater knowledge than the words conveyed. Miss Marple listened with quiet attention, cataloguing each small irregularity, each subtle clue. Mrs. Brimley hovered close to Clarissa, attempting to offer comfort, yet betraying her own anxiety. Her frequent glances toward the pergola and the occasional stiffening when Mr. Ashcroft's name was mentioned did not escape Miss Marple's notice. It suggested that the events of the morning had stirred not only fear but memories, perhaps regrets, of incidents long past or secrets best left unspoken. A sudden murmur rippled through the garden as one of the younger women, Miss Lettice Howard, whispered something to a companion, her voice trembling slightly with excitement. Miss Marple, curious, leaned forward just enough to catch the tail end of the remark. "I'm certain I saw him near the hedge last night." It was a fleeting comment, dismissed quickly by the speaker, yet it carried a weight that could not be ignored. The hedge, the body, and the events that had unfolded were no accident. Someone had intentionally placed themselves, and perhaps others, within the scene. The children, still curious but careful under the watchful eyes of their elders, continued to observe the adults with quiet intensity. Jane Tilling, her doll pressed tightly to her chest, occasionally peeked between the legs of grown-ups, her expression earnest and attentive. Miss Marple, noting this, reflected that children's observations often revealed truths adults could not see, their small perspectives untarnished by social politeness or fear of judgment. Miss Marple allowed her gaze to drift once more toward the ivy-covered pergola. The shadows beneath it were deeper now in the afternoon light, concealing corners and crannies where a person could have crouched, waited, or hidden. The fallen lace she had seen earlier had been swept aside by the wind, but its presence, however fleeting, hinted at an intrusion, a disturbance, or perhaps a confrontation that had gone unnoticed by the other villagers. Every detail mattered, she reminded herself, however small or easily dismissed. By the time tea was offered under the magnolia, the inspector had taken preliminary notes and promised to return with the local coroner. The villagers, though outwardly polite, remained tense, exchanging whispered conjectures and tentative theories. Miss Marple, knitting quietly in her lap, noted the nuances of each conversation, the small pauses, the suppressed reactions, and the subtle attempts at misdirection. It was a delicate dance of human behavior, revealing more than any direct statement could. As shadows lengthened and the afternoon waned, Miss Marple felt a quiet certainty settle within her. The apparent disorder of the morning, the shock, the confusion, the murmured gossip, was beginning to yield to a discernible pattern. She could see the outlines of motives, the faint traces of opportunity, and the subtle signals of human emotion that, when woven together, would illuminate the truth. In her mind, the threads were aligning, though the final picture remained just beyond immediate reach. Beneath the warm sun and the gentle rustle of leaves, the village of St. Mary Mead was settling into a fragile calm, yet Miss Marple understood that the real work had only just begun. The ordinary facades of the garden party, the polite smiles and the carefully chosen words masked a far deeper intrigue. And as always, it would take nothing more than careful observation, patient reasoning, and an understanding of human nature to unravel the secrets that Honeysuckle Cottage had so quietly harbored. As evening approached, the sunlight softened to a honeyed glow, casting long, slanting shadows across the garden and lending a strange serenity to the otherwise tense atmosphere. Miss Marple remained in her familiar spot beneath the magnolia, her hands idle, her mind alert. The inspector had called for a temporary pause in questioning, intending to return the following morning with more formal procedures and the coroner, but the villagers were far from calm. Whispered conjectures drifted through the garden like restless wind, each suggestion more elaborate than the last, weaving a web of suspicion that Miss Marple studied with quiet fascination. Clarissa had retreated further under the magnolia's branches, her gaze fixed on the fading shadows at the edge of the hedge. Her lips moved silently, forming words only she could hear, and occasionally her hand would lift to brush against her temple as if trying to will away the weight pressing upon her thoughts. Miss Marple watched this carefully, noting not only her distress, but the subtle interactions with Mr. Ashcroft. Though he remained outwardly composed, there were brief, fleeting gestures, a small inclination of the head, a slight narrowing of the eyes that betrayed a keen attention to Clarissa's mood. Miss Marple made a quiet note. He was observing her as much as she was observing him. Mrs. Brimley hovered in nervous loops around the garden, engaging in polite conversation with anyone who would speak to her. Her words, though cheerful, were delivered with a precision that betrayed a mind preoccupied with control. Every glance toward the pergola or the window of a Honeysuckle Cottage seemed calculated, as if expecting some revelation at any moment. Miss Marple, accustomed to reading such nuances, recognized the telltale signs of someone attempting to maintain appearances while harboring inner unease. The children, emboldened by the lapse in adult attention, crept closer to the site of the morning's discovery. Jane Tilling, in particular, lingered near the hedge, her small fingers brushing over fallen leaves as though seeking to reconstruct a story from the remnants of the day. Miss Marple's mind registered the girl's movements, noting how her innocence allowed her to move unobserved and unjudged, the perfect opportunity for quiet observation to uncover hidden details. A sudden murmur from one of the villagers drew Miss Marple's attention. Mrs. Howard, a tall, thin woman known for her sharp tongue, whispered conspiratorially to a small group, her hand gesturing toward the cottage window. "I saw someone moving behind that curtain yesterday," she said, her voice low but insistent. "I thought it was the wind at first, but now—" She let the sentence trail off, allowing the weight of implication to hang in the air. Miss Marple's sharp eyes followed her gesture, noting the subtle tension in the window frame and the faint impression of footprints near the sill. A minor clue, seemingly insignificant, yet to Miss Marple it hinted at observation, presence, and perhaps knowledge of events the others had overlooked. The inspector, attempting to maintain authority, called for calm, but the villagers' anxiety made orderly retreat impossible. They drifted in small, anxious groups, exchanging glances that suggested suspicion, fear, and sometimes resentment. Miss Marple, however, remained composed, recognizing that each interaction, each whispered remark, offered insight into both motive and opportunity. A glance at Mr. Ashcroft revealed the same quiet calculation she had noticed earlier. A man measuring reactions, testing boundaries, and perhaps shielding a hidden agenda. As the day darkened into twilight, Miss Marple's thoughts returned to the ivy-clad pergola. The shadows beneath it seemed deeper now, concealing corners where someone might have watched or waited. She recalled the fragment of lace she had noticed earlier, delicate and easily overlooked, and the subtle disturbances in the grass and soil that suggested movement. Though others would dismiss these details as trivial, Miss Marple understood that they might hold the key to untangling the mystery. The villagers began to drift toward their homes, the chatter softening into uneasy silence, leaving the garden with an air of muted expectation. Clarissa lingered a moment longer, glancing toward Mr. Ashcroft, who finally stepped away with a careful, polite nod. Mrs. Brimley, too, lingered under the magnolia, her eyes reflecting both worry and a fragile hope that the day's chaos might yet be contained. Miss Marple, however, sensed that the calm was only superficial. Beneath it lay a tangle of concealed motives, hidden resentments, and carefully guarded secrets. The events of the morning had been no accident, and every person in the garden, whether aware of it or not, had a role to play in the unfolding story. As she gathered her shawl and prepared to take a slow, contemplative walk along the garden path, Miss Marple knew that the threads of the mystery were beginning to draw together, and the first hints of the truth were ready to reveal themselves to the patient and the observant. Night had fallen over St. Mary Mead, and the village, usually so quiet at this hour, seemed charged with a restrained tension that seeped into every cottage and lane. Miss Marple, however, remained calm, her small figure moving silently through the garden paths of Honeysuckle Cottage as she examined the subtle disturbances left by the day's events. The roses glistened under the soft glow of a single lamp, dew clinging to petals, but beneath the beauty, the evidence of hurried footsteps, scuffed soil, and disturbed ivy hinted at movements no one had yet accounted for. Inside the cottage, Clarissa sat quietly in the drawing room, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Her mind replayed the events with relentless insistence. The morning's laughter, the sudden discovery of the body, the arrival of the stranger, and the hushed gossip that had followed. Each recollection brought a pang of anxiety, as though some truth had been glimpsed and then hidden just out of reach. Miss Marple, seated in a chair across the room under the pretense of having been invited to tea, noticed these fluctuations in emotion with gentle, precise observation. She did not speak of the obvious. Instead, she allowed Clarissa to reveal herself in fragments, through small gestures, half-formed sentences, and fleeting expressions. The sound of careful footsteps on the garden path drew Miss Marple's attention. Mr. Ashcroft had returned, a subtle stiffness in his movements betraying that he had not left entirely at ease. He greeted Clarissa with a formal, composed nod, though Miss Marple could detect the tension in the slight downturn of his mouth, the careful alignment of his coat, and the way his eyes swept the room before settling. His return suggested more than concern for the young lady. It implied involvement, vigilance, and perhaps calculation. Mrs. Brimley hovered at the door, her eyes darting from her niece to the visitor and then to Miss Marple herself. She attempted to appear composed, but the faint tremor in her hands and the hurried, uneven rhythm of her breathing betrayed an inner disquiet. Miss Marple, ever patient, catalogued each movement, knowing that in moments like these it was the smallest, most subconscious gestures that revealed the most about a person's state of mind and possible intentions. Tea was poured, cups arranged, with meticulous care, yet the conversation remained tentative, polite, and layered with unspoken tension. Villagers were long gone, leaving behind an atmosphere of suspended anticipation, as though the garden itself were holding its breath. Miss Marple observed the interplay of glances, Clarissa's nervous shifts, Mr. Ashcroft's controlled attention, and Mrs. Brimley's vigilant supervision. The subtle interplay, the minor adjustments, were all clues in a puzzle not yet complete. The evening deepened, shadows stretching along the walls of the drawing room, and Miss Marple gently probed, her voice soft, almost casual, in order to draw the hidden truths to the surface. "It is remarkable," she said, her tone light, "how even the smallest actions can reveal what we are trying to conceal. One cannot help but notice patterns if one watches closely enough." Clarissa's hands stilled briefly, and her gaze flicked toward the garden window, betraying recognition of the unspoken meaning in the observation. A sudden noise from the kitchen, a cup rattling against a saucer, caused both Clarissa and Mr. Ashcroft to start slightly. Miss Marple, however, remained composed, noting the involuntary reactions with meticulous attention. There was something in the flinch, the pause before composed speech returned, that suggested nerves frayed not by fear of an accident, but by the presence of a truth unspoken. As the evening waned, Miss Marple's thoughts drifted back to the morning's garden. The body behind the hedge, the fragment of lace in the ivy, the faint impressions of footsteps, each detail now seemed to converge with the emotional landscape of those gathered in the drawing-room. Someone had orchestrated events carefully, using subtlety rather than force, timing rather than recklessness. And those who had witnessed, who had participated, all bore small traces of knowledge, fear, or complicity. Outside, the wind rustled the honeysuckle along the trellis, a quiet whisper against the darkened windows, as if the garden itself were conspiring to hold secrets close. Miss Marple understood instinctively that the night would bring reflection, small admissions, and the stirring of concealed motives. And when the morning came, when the villagers gathered again and the investigation resumed in earnest, the careful observations, the fleeting reactions, and the unnoticed movements of the previous day would begin to crystallize, revealing the true path that had led to the tragic discovery beneath the ivy. In the quiet of the drawing-room, the three of them, Miss Marple, Clarissa, and Mr. Ashcroft, sat in a delicate triangle of observation, each unaware of just how closely they were being studied. Beneath the gentle veneer of civility, the threads of tension and suspicion intertwined, ready to unravel with the first careful pull of insight. Miss Marple, serene yet alert, knew that patience, observation, and a subtle understanding of human nature would soon uncover the secrets that Honeysuckle Cottage had guarded so carefully. The next morning dawned pale and overcast, casting a muted light over St. Mary Mead and lending the village a somber, reflective air. Miss Marple rose early, as was her habit, and took a slow walk along the familiar paths near Honeysuckle Cottage. The garden, now quiet and dew-laden, revealed traces of the previous day's disturbances. The faint depressions in the grass where someone had crouched, the scattered petals of a knocked-over rose bush, and the subtle indentation near the pergola's ivy that hinted at a presence now absent. Each detail, seemingly minor, began to assemble itself into a narrative that only a careful observer could discern. By the time the inspector and his assistant arrived, the village had begun to stir with whispers. The morning light revealed anxious faces at windows, the soft movement of curtains as villagers tried discreetly to observe who came and went, and the faint murmur of speculation along the streets. Miss Marple, entering the drawing-room of Honeysuckle Cottage with a quiet grace, immediately noted the contrast between outward composure and inner tension displayed by Clarissa and her aunt. Mrs. Brimley, already pacing in small, precise circles, gave a stiff nod to the inspector but betrayed her unease with a slight quiver of the lip. Clarissa, seated by the window, clutched a handkerchief tightly, her eyes tracing the garden as if hoping to see something that would make sense of the chaos. Miss Marple, settling quietly into a chair nearby, allowed the young woman's mannerisms to speak for themselves. Small actions, the trembling of fingers, the tilt of the head, the hesitation before words, provided a richer understanding than any spoken explanation. Miss Marple's mind catalogued each nuance, recognizing them as pieces of a larger, intricate puzzle. The inspector began formal questioning, his tone measured, aiming to establish a timeline of events. Villagers had gathered in small groups outside, watching discreetly while exchanging murmured theories about the morning's horror. The police method was methodical, but Miss Marple knew that the true key to understanding lay not in rigid statements, but in the subtle interactions, half-truths, and fleeting glances that hinted at concealed knowledge. Mr. Ashcroft, arriving once more under the guise of concern for Clarissa, maintained his calm demeanor, but Miss Marple observed the slight tightening of his hands and the meticulous alignment of his coat as he listened to the inspector's inquiries. It was a careful performance, she noted, as if each movement were calculated to maintain an appearance of detachment, while concealing investment in the unfolding investigation. A sudden exclamation from one of the villagers outside, Mrs. Howard, drew attention. She had spotted a small, overlooked object near the hedge, a button half buried in soil, its color a subtle match to the jacket Mr. Ashcroft had been wearing the previous day. The inspector examined it quickly, noting its potential significance, yet Miss Marple's sharp eyes discerned more. The manner in which the soil clung to the edges suggested it had been dropped deliberately rather than lost by accident. Here was a trace, a silent signal of movement, of presence, and perhaps of intent. The children, still observing cautiously, had ventured closer under the watchful eye of Jane's mother, but Miss Marple noted that their small, unobtrusive perspective offered a unique insight into behavior unnoticed by adults. She planned to speak with Jane later, aware that what the girl had seen yesterday might clarify subtle patterns overlooked by more conventional inquiries. Tea was brought in once again, though the mood was now one of restrained observation rather than casual conversation. Miss Marple used the quiet moments to probe lightly, engaging Clarissa in conversation about innocuous subjects while observing reactions. Clarissa's responses, carefully measured yet revealing tiny flashes of emotion, provided Miss Marple with subtle indicators of her awareness, fear, and perhaps knowledge beyond what she would openly admit. By late morning, a clearer picture of the garden's events began to emerge. Miss Marple, combining the traces of physical evidence with the behavior of those present, felt a quiet certainty forming. The apparent accident, the body behind the hedge, the fragment of lace, the unnoticed button, and the furtive gestures and glances of several villagers now began to intertwine into a narrative that, though not yet complete, pointed toward deliberate action and concealed motives. The inspector, while efficient and thorough, relied on conventional methods, yet Miss Marple understood that the key to resolving the mystery lay in reading the humans involved rather than merely cataloguing physical evidence. She watched, listened, and waited, allowing the threads of observation to weave themselves into coherence. Beneath the polite facades, the carefully measured words and the restrained movements, the truth of Honeysuckle Cottage's dark morning was slowly revealing itself, and Miss Marple knew that the critical moment, the first deliberate test of those involved, was approaching, bringing the mystery closer to its inevitable revelation. The inspector's departure that afternoon left Honeysuckle Cottage wrapped in a fragile quiet, the sort that settles when the official business has concluded, but the truth still lingers in the air, waiting to be acknowledged. Miss Marple remained seated in the drawing-room a while longer, her knitting untouched in her lap, her eyes resting gently on Clarissa, who stood by the window with a distant, uncertain gaze. It was not fear alone that troubled the young woman. Miss Marple detected the deeper tremor of guilt, or perhaps the burden of something known but unspoken. Outside, the villagers had thinned, though a few still lingered at respectful distance, whispering softly in clusters. St. Mary Mead thrived on speculation during such times, weaving far more elaborate tales than reality, yet occasionally stumbling upon truths out of sheer intuition. It was this environment, a blend of gossip, observation, and human nature, that Miss Marple navigated with practiced ease. She excused herself delicately, stepping out into the garden with her parasol tilted to the soft afternoon sun. The garden felt different now. The hush around the hedge seemed heavier, as though the place remembered what had happened and held its breath in anticipation of what was yet to come. Miss Marple paused by the pergola, crouching quietly to inspect a faint scuff in the soil. The pattern spoke of someone who had knelt or crouched, then risen again in haste. The small disruptions in the ivy above it offered an even more telling detail. Someone had reached in deliberately, with intent, not merely brushing by. As she rose, Miss Marple heard light footsteps approaching over the gravel and turned to see Jane, the little girl from the village, hovering shyly at the edge of the path. Jane's mother had sent her on an errand to Mrs. Brimley, but the child had clearly detoured, her curiosity and youthful courage compelling her forward. Miss Marple's expression softened, and she lowered herself slightly, inviting trust. Jane spoke quietly, almost conspiratorially. She had seen something yesterday, something she had been too frightened to mention when the inspector questioned her. She described a figure near the hedge not long before the commotion, someone who had moved quickly and looked over their shoulder twice. Jane hesitated before naming the person, glancing nervously back toward the cottage, but Miss Marple reassured her with a gentle hand on her arm. The name she finally offered was not unexpected, yet hearing it from an innocent observer carried a significance too great to ignore. Miss Marple thanked the child and watched her skip away, feeling the weight of her new information settle into the already forming pattern. The button found in the soil, the fragment of lace snagged on ivy, the anxious behavior inside the cottage, and now the confirmed presence of someone who had claimed to be elsewhere. It all nudged the truth closer to the surface. Returning inside, Miss Marple encountered Mr. Ashcroft in the hallway, his composure slightly frayed despite his attempt at calmness. He claimed to be checking on Clarissa once more, but the slight quiver in his voice and the too careful placement of his words betrayed strain. He asked Miss Marple directly whether she believed the inspector was close to catching the culprit. Her answer was mild, her tone gentle, but her eyes watched him closely. She mentioned, almost as an afterthought, how curious it was that the garden path held so many footprints, some quite recent, despite the late hour of the previous night. He stiffened almost imperceptibly, a small reaction but too sharp to ignore. Miss Marple allowed the moment to pass, her expression remaining kindly, knowing she had gleaned what she needed. These small tests, barely noticeable to those she administered them to, were her subtle method of discerning truth from pretense. As evening drew near, the atmosphere within Honeysuckle Cottage shifted again. Clarissa seemed restless, pacing softly, while Mrs. Brimley busied herself with unnecessary tasks, each movement more hurried than the last. There was a sense, faint but growing, that someone in the house was preparing for something. The air felt charged, expectant, as though concealed truths were pressing outward, seeking escape. In the drawing room once more, Miss Marple took a seat and waited patiently. She knew the crucial moment had come. The mystery had reached the delicate point where one more careful touch, one more gentle suggestion placed in the right ear, would send the fragile facade of composure cracking. She had almost all the pieces, but one final reaction, one final slip, would reveal the identity of the person who had orchestrated the morning's tragic event. And she sensed, with an intuition honed by years of observing human frailty, that the next few hours at Honeysuckle Cottage would provide exactly what she required. The evening settled over Honeysuckle Cottage like a slowly drawn curtain, dimming the rooms into soft half-shadows that seemed to heighten every breath and every unspoken fear. Miss Marple remained seated in the drawing room, her knitting resting loosely in her lap, though she had scarcely made a stitch in the last hour. She sensed a shift, not abrupt, but gradual, like the tightening of a thread that had finally reached its end. Someone in the house was nearing the point where composure could no longer hold. Clarissa entered the room first, her face pale beneath the lamplight, hands clasped anxiously as though steadiness depended upon that one small anchor. She hesitated near the fireplace, her eyes darting briefly toward the hallway, then settling on Miss Marple with a fragile attempt at a smile. Miss Marple returned it gently, offering no pressure, only the silent assurance of someone who understood far more than she allowed others to see. Moments later, Mr. Ashcroft stepped in with a stiffness that betrayed both reluctance and resolve. He greeted Miss Marple politely, but the lines at his temples pulsed faintly. A man under strain, carrying a guilt or fear that pressed heavily upon him. He took a seat opposite her, smoothing the front of his jacket with unnecessary precision. Mrs. Brimley followed soon after, fussing with a tray of fresh tea as though clinging to the routine might somehow restore normalcy to the house. The four of them gathered in a silence so taut it felt like a held breath. Miss Marple let it linger, sensing that silence, more than interrogation, often pushed the nervous toward revelation. The room was warm, yet Clarissa shivered. Mr. Ashcroft, despite trying to appear composed, could not prevent his eyes from flicking toward the garden-facing window every so often. Mrs. Brimley hovered near the doorway, hands clasped tightly, as though bracing herself. Miss Marple began with the softest of comments, one that appeared entirely harmless on the surface. She remarked on how dreadfully unfortunate it was that the garden, once the pride of Mrs. Brimley's careful tending, had become the setting of such an unsettling discovery. Her tone was light, conversational, even sympathetic. But the remark landed like a pebble dropped into still water, creating ripples across each face. Clarissa's breathing hitched. Mr. Ashcroft's fingers tightened around the armrest. Mrs. Brimley stepped closer, drawn in despite herself. Miss Marple continued, her voice calm and thoughtful. Speaking of the footprints found near the hedge, how curious it was that some of them seemed far too recent for an accident that was supposed to have happened long before the garden party. She noted, almost idly, that the button found in the soil had not been carelessly dropped, as many first assumed, but rather placed, or perhaps shaken loose, during a moment of haste or struggle. She watched Mr. Ashcroft as she spoke, observing not his words but the tightening of his jaw, the swallow he attempted to disguise, and the subtle shift in his posture as though preparing for defense. Clarissa, on the other hand, seemed torn between speaking and remaining silent. Her eyes glistened with a truth she longed to release but couldn't admit aloud. Each tremor of her hand, each furtive glance toward Mr. Ashcroft, deepened Miss Marple's certainty. With gentle precision, Miss Marple then mentioned Jane, the little girl who had seen someone near the hedge before the commotion. A harmless detail to most, but not to those who had been untruthful about their whereabouts. Mr. Ashcroft's composure cracked ever so slightly. He shifted, leaning forward as though compelled to correct or question, but he stopped himself just short, realizing that any protest might reveal far more than silence. Miss Marple caught the flicker of calculation in his eyes, the internal battle between maintaining his narrative and confronting the truth that Miss Marple had quietly laid before him. Mrs. Brimley, witnessing the tension, steadied herself against a chair, her breath quickening. Something in her expression shifted, a dawning horror, not at the discovery itself, but at what it implied about someone she trusted. Miss Marple leaned back slightly, her demeanor unchanged, her voice soft and grandmotherly. She remarked how peculiar human behavior could be, how guilt often manifested not in dramatic gestures but in tiny inconsistencies. A misplaced button, a too cautious alibi, the subtle avoidance of eye contact at the mention of ivy on a hedge. The room tightened around them. Each person's silence grew heavier, more telling. Then Miss Marple delivered the final test. She spoke a simple, calmly uttered line, an observation framed as a mere thought. She said that the person who moved the body had likely returned to the garden later that night, perhaps believing they had overlooked something important. Clarissa gasped softly. Mrs. Brimley's hand flew to her mouth, but it was Mr. Ashcroft who reacted most sharply. His entire posture jolted, a breath caught too abruptly, as though the words had struck him like a physical blow. Miss Marple lowered her eyes to her knitting, appearing almost apologetic. But inwardly, she knew. The reaction was unmistakable. The thread she had been pulling gently all day had finally come free. She now had what she needed. The final reveal was close. The wind outside had settled into a low, steady hum, as if the entire landscape were holding its breath for the truth about to break. Inspector Hale stepped closer to the narrow desk where the final pieces of evidence lay. Ilara's hidden ledger, the torn map of the underground corridors, and the silver locket she had tried so desperately to deny owning. Marcus stood beside him, his voice low. Everything matches the timeline now, the meeting in the bell tower, the forged letters. Her attempt to pin it all on the caretaker. She was trying to erase every loose end. Hale nodded slowly. But she miscalculated one thing, he murmured, lifting the locket between gloved fingers. Sentiment. Inside the locket was the tiny photograph of a man, Jonas, the missing historian whose disappearance had sparked the first whisper of suspicion. And beneath the photograph, folded so precisely that only trained eyes would notice it, was a single scrap of parchment from the original Greystone archives. The missing fragment, the one Jonas had supposedly vanished with. Hale exhaled, the truth settling into place like the final piece of a long unsolved puzzle. She never meant to kill him, he said. Only silence him long enough to retrieve the map. But when he threatened to expose her, panic took over. Marcus swallowed hard, his expression darkening. And everything after that, the sabotage, the false leads, the staged break-in, was her way of burying her own trail. Footsteps approached from the corridor. The constable stepped in, gently guiding Alara forward, her wrists bound, her calm facade finally cracked. She didn't struggle, didn't deny, only stared at Hale with a strange mixture of defiance and resignation. "You pieced it together neatly, Inspector," she said quietly. "But tell me, would anyone else have done differently? When a lifetime of research is stolen, when the truth you devoted everything to is locked behind doors others will never open." Hale held her gaze, steady and unflinching. "Some truths are worth protecting," he said, "but not at the cost of a life. Not like this." Her shoulders sagged, the fight draining from her as the constable led her away. Hale watched her disappear around the corner, the echo of the steps fading like the last note of a long, haunting song. Marcus closed the ledger. "So, that's it. The end of the Greystone puzzle." Hale shook his head faintly. "No, not the end. Mysteries like Greystone never end. They simply return to silence until someone listens again." Outside, the bell tower loomed against the gray sky. The investigation was over, but its shadow would linger, etched into the stones, carried in the wind, whispered through the halls long after the last lantern had been extinguished. Hale stepped out into the cold, hands in his coat pockets, the case file tucked under his arm. Another riddle solved, another night claimed by justice. Yet as he walked away from the ancient estate, he couldn't shake the faint sense that somewhere in the quiet distance, Greystone was still watching.